As always, we try to start with Australia first. Now, I want to take you way back to about 20-something years ago, okay? And believe me, this time machine adventure will be worth it. The trains in Sydney in the early 2000s, post the Olympics, were not fantastic. They were always running late. There were all sorts of problems. If one problem happened at one train station, the entire network would be knocked over. Slowly but surely, that system has been tried to be cleaned up over a long time. But of course, when the trains run late in any major capital city, it becomes a political problem. And back then, Bob Carr was the New South Wales Premier and was very, very good at politics when it came to the handling of things. I remember going to a press conference once as a young reporter where he announced that people who were already serving a life term will serve a life term in jail. He was good at being able to change the subject. And that government made a decision that rather than admit that the trains were constantly running late, they just changed the timetable, that literally late didn't mean late anymore. It was if it arrived within, I think, about 10 minutes of the actual time, then it technically wasn't late. So, ta-da! The late trains just disappear. Well, a perfect example of that now, 20 years later, is being deployed by Chris Bowen, one of many young Labor people who learnt via the feet and the ways of Bob Carr and the way that he did things way back when. Again, very successful politically. But we're not talking about trains running late here. We know that Chris Bowen, along with the Prime Minister, is trying to change the electricity system from the one that worked to the one that will make people feel good. It'll cost the best part of $1 trillion to do so. And of course, it's more expensive. But if you say it enough times, people will eventually forget that their bills keep going up, right?
The cheapest, most reliable form of energy for Australians, and that, of course, is renewable energy.
Renewables, the cheapest form of energy.
Cheapest energy prices going forward.
Renewable energy is incredibly cheap.
Now, for 15 years that I've been honoured enough to be sitting here and in your lounge room or wherever you happen to watch the show, I've never been in denial of climate change nor the potential benefits of things like renewable energy. But what I have said, regardless of whom the person is who's pushing it or the leader who was promising it, the cost of transition was always going to be the problem for me. And the cost of transition has been obvious. As we go from a system that works to a completely new one that is being built, as I say, it could cost up to $1 trillion for us to do it. And yes, the government will stump up some of the money. Private companies might absorb some of it, but it's pretty obvious who has to pay a big chunk of it. You.
Power prices are set to increase.
Power bills are climbing.
Australian families brace for even higher power bills.
So what is the trains aren't running late solution that Chris Bowen and the energy regulator are going to put in place? Well, bear with me because this one kind of takes the cake for the way modern politics works. The way it is going to work is that apparently energy retailers will be restricted to only increasing their prices once a year. In colloquial terms, this is a little bit like those politician pay rises. Yeah, people will bitch and moan for a couple of days and then they won't talk about it again for the rest of the year. But the reality is that if it is just a once a year increase, then those increases are going to be sharper and sharper and sharper until we eventually get to the time when all of the stuff has been built, it's all paid itself off, and then we start to see potentially what renewable energy is to the customer versus the existing systems that have worked. But let me read from this story today. The Australian Energy Market Commission has announced the changes on Thursday, entrenching a sweep of new rules designed to protect consumers from price shocks. Doesn't mean prices won't go up, but retailers will now be limited to lifting prices once a year and must ensure that customers who sign up to a plan with a temporary benefit do not roll over to one that is higher than the default price. Further, there is now a ban on what the AMEC calls unreasonably high penalties for not paying a bill on time. There's also a ban on fees, except for network charges, for vulnerable customers. Okay, there's no real problem with that, but still, you can imagine once a year, and they're going to pretend, oh, it's not our fault, it's somebody else making the decision. It's exactly the same logic as the trains and exactly the same logic as pay rises for MPs. Providers must also limit fees and charges to reasonable costs for all other consumers. But interestingly, on the very same day that the government was finding a way to kind of hide the reality of the cost from one energy system to the new energy system, and remember at the election just been, they promised no cuts to electricity prices in the way they had previously promised at the election before this. So with no promise for your power bills to go down, we've just found a way that your power bills will go up. It just won't be as randomly as it has been in the past. Therefore, everyone's annoyed for a couple of days. We'll make the announcement, the week before Christmas? They'll do it on the King's birthday public holiday. You know how all this is going to work. And all of it will, of course, politically be amazing. And anyone who talks about power prices being an electoral problem, it's just a crazy person making stuff up, right? This is a classic example about public policy moving from jumping into the pot of boiling water to the frog in boiling water, where slowly but surely it turns warmer and warmer until it is too late to realise it's boiling and you are cooked. But on the very same day that that announcement was being made, what about people who owe money to Jim Chalmers? And by that I mean the federal government, and by that I mean, of course, the Australian Taxation Office. Well, it's very different, you see. If you are late with your payments on a power bill, it will be basically illegal to have to pay a fine for that. But if you are late with money to the Australian Tax Office, guess what's going to happen? With over $50 billion in outstanding tax debt owed to the Australian Tax Office, the government wants to make it much less attractive for people to delay paying their tax bills. However, the rules are changing, and accountants warn that recently passed legislation by the federal government regarding the tax deductibility of ATO interest has potential to push struggling small businesses over the edge and into liquidation. From July the 1st, if you owe money to the Australian Tax Office, you will no longer be able to claim a tax deduction on the interest that they charge you. So let's be very clear. The private companies that sell you the electricity, that the government is forcing them to change the sources by which electricity is created, they can't charge any extra fines for late payments. If you're late with a payment to the Australian Tax Office, that system changes and the interest that is going to be charged goes through the roof. Let me continue with some of the analysis about what took place here today. Talk about a double standard, anyone? Without tax deductibility, the Australian Tax Office interest rate of 10.78% from July 1 becomes an effective interest rate of 14.37% for small businesses and an effective interest rate of 20% for individuals on the highest marginal tax rate. So again, don't you love this? Rules for the power industry, because that causes political problems. If you end up owing a tax bill, if you are late with paying that tax bill because maybe you don't have the money, no mercy for you. Instead, jack it up, jack it up, jack it up. And remember, that number that was owing of outstanding tax was about $50 billion. Well, let's again look at the confusing logic of this government, particularly when it comes to the amount of money that the taxpayer is owed by people who have gone to university and the taxpayer has paid for them to go through their tertiary education. The total amount owing to taxpayers in HECS, outstanding HECS, is $81.4 billion. Now, we know that the way that the Labor Party was able to get a whole bunch of young people to vote for it, not the Greens, because they were worried about what might happen to the left, was that they just forgave billions of dollars worth of that $80 billion worth of debt. Now, they're not willing to do it when it comes to the tax office. No. If you owe them money, no changes, no forgiveness for small business. Oh, look, we know you paid all the bills in the past. Let's just drop it by a third, right? Because we want to keep you in business and you employed. But the triangle of dependency, where you hand out for the government or you work for the government or the biggest client is government, is the real game here. Anyone else, like a small business, can, well, just bugger off. As you know, decision was made during the election to cut 20% of thousands of people's student debt loans. The Albanese Labor government will cut a further 20% off student debt. This will wipe out $16 billion. So $81 billion minus $16 billion And that is how much money is still left over, which is still way more than the total amount outstanding right now when it comes to the tax office. So to repeat for, I think, the 6th time, but it's still important to know who this government truly values. Small business? If you owe money to the tax office, bugger you. We're going to increase the rate that you have to pay it back by if you are late. The tax office, that in part will be administering the, $65 billion outstanding in unpaid university fees? Well, who cares? Because those small business people, too small a number, as opposed to the young people who, of course, they want to vote, which means you get 94 seats in the parliament. You tell small business to get stuffed, but the uni students keep voting Labor. Happy times, happy times. And the trains now run on time. As you know, I have remained steadfast in a conversation about immigration. And it is not a cultural conversation about immigration. It is literally a capacity conversation. Australia is at 27 million people. That number has exploded in just the past 20 years. You know that at the turn of the century, I think it was closer to about 18 million people that we had in the country, but slowly but surely, yes, people have babies, but more people end up coming to the country. They come to the country as skilled workers, or they come to the country as family reunion. We also know that this Prime Minister, when this was a bit of a political issue, back before they could change the subject to Medicare and ooga boogers about Peter Dutton, all of which were successful, all of which the Australian people endorsed, people had a problem with the number of people that were coming in because, as you know, the more people who come in, the more people there are to every single potential queue in Australia, especially when it comes to housing. You know, that small problem of where do people live? But who cares? We're just growing the tax base, which in part is what Chalmers was talking about yesterday with his whole plans for a sustainable budget, which put simply means despite how much they have to spend, they have to have more people paying tax and more taxes put on even those that are already paying their tax. But the eagle eyes at the Daily Telegraph the Daily Mail have called out the BS from the Prime Minister, who, remember, promised to cut immigration. In fact, they made a promise just before the election in the budget that was released just before the election. And Australia took in 340,800 migrants last year. That is higher than the forecast of 335,000 arrivals for the 24-25 financial year. It's 76% higher than the pre-pandemic intakes of 194,000. The new figures were released on Thursday, a day after Jim Chalmers had admitted that Australia would struggle to build 1.2 million households in the 5 years to 2029 to accommodate the population explosion. Now, of course, as you know, if you talk about this in any way, shape or form, and again, it was partly successful and part of the mix as to how the government was able to get re-elected. Any conversation about migration is somehow an attack on anyone who has migrated to the country. Now, you and I both know that's not true. You and I both know that it takes me an extra 30 seconds to read that disclaimer because it is what I believe and I don't want it to be misinterpreted. But just like the lies about the Medicare card and the lies about population, it doesn't matter because a compliant press who are happy with the arrangements that they have, who want more access, who want to be able to fly around the world, listening to the Prime Minister slaying diplomatic dragons like saying g'day to world leaders like we told you last night, they don't want to rock this boat. But again, if you do even have a conversation about, OK, cool, hundreds of thousands more people come in, there's not enough houses, that's a problem, right? Oh, no, apparently to even discuss that issue, you get hit with the R word.
Racist.
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 Racist. Racist.
Racist. Racist.
But just a reminder that the intergenerational report, the same one that I show you oh so often that tells us about those budget deficits between this year and the 2060s, it also says that Australia's population is headed above 40 million people by the 2060s. In fact, according to the intergenerational report, the report projects that 40.5 million people will live in Australia by the early 2060s. This is the same report that tells us that despite that huge population increase, there will be a decade of deficits. And of course, the plan for all of this is the magic two words that were said 5 times by the Treasurer this week, and the code is tax increases.
Tax reform, tax reform, tax reform, tax reform, tax reform, tax reform, tax reform.
All right, let's turn our attention to the issues of war that are happening around the world. And before we get to the Trump of it all, let's deal with the Australians of it all. Remember earlier in the week I told you that there was 300 people in Israel, 350 people from Iran who are Australians wanting to return back to Australia. Well, those numbers have gone through the roof. We learned today that the Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, has described the situation in the Middle East as incredibly dangerous, increasingly dangerous, thanks Scoop. But here's the detail. About 1,500 Australians in Iran, 1,200 are in Israel, have registered for assistance to get out of Dodge, to get out of those countries, and she anticipates that the number will increase. Here is the Foreign Minister.
Those numbers, I anticipate, will continue to climb. They've certainly increased over the last few days.
But of course, airports completely closed in both countries, the focus of those trying to get out of Israel. Well, they are literally turning to tour guides to try to find ways out. But have a look at this story that was in the Channel 9 newspapers where a mother whose 30-year-old son was stuck in Tel Aviv after last week's retaliatory attacks, says that she was incredibly angry and disappointed by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. People are dying on both sides and the government has washed their hands completely. People are feeling abandoned by the government. They feel like the government doesn't care. Now, I have no doubt that if that was your kid that was there, you would feel like that. In reality, you can't move these couple of thousands of people as quickly as possible or all at once because you can't fly them out because, for obvious reasons, with missiles raining down in both countries, but particularly in Israel, it is impossible to move a large amount of people. But here is Penny Wong with the latest from her end of things.
We took the opportunity to assist a small group out across a land border crossing over in the last 24 hours, and we hope to have more able to be moved today. Obviously, that does depend on the security situation on the ground.
All right, let's turn our attention to the Trump of it all. Will he or won't he? Of course, no one knows, apart from the president, and we will find out whether it does or doesn't happen in the next few days. But right now, 17 minutes past 9 in Canberra, Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane. Right now, it is 17 minutes past 2 in the afternoon in Israel. It is 47 or 13 minutes away from 3 o'clock in the afternoon in Iran, and it is 18 minutes past 7 o'clock in the morning in Washington, D.C. Now, just as I joked and told you about last night, that despite the apparent urgency of the president having to get back from the G7, the reality was that it probably wasn't that urgent. He just was done with Macron and the rest of them and certainly looked at the B team that he was about to meet, including Australia's Prime Minister, who, remember, wasn't even allowed to eat with the big boy countries, so he had no interest in visiting the kids' table. And despite the fact that he was coming back to deal with the beginnings of World War III, as I told you, what he was actually doing in part of this was putting 2 new flagpoles at the front and back of the White House. They're cool, they're big, they're a personal gift, and I think they look nice in and around the White House. But that's what in part he was doing, not exactly dealing with the beginnings of World War III or the end of the nuclear program in Iran. And as you've heard, he is not telling anyone what he's going to do right now, and he won't decide till a second before.
I may do it, I may not do it. I mean, nobody knows what I'm going to do. I can tell you this, that Iran's got a lot of trouble.
Now, apart from the will he and won't he and what the potential consequences are, there apparently might be some problems with whether this bomb is actually the right bomb to do what is needed to be done. Because, yes, the Iranian facility, which is underneath that mountain, is it going to be too deep and not able to be penetrated? Well, as you know, it's only American planes that can fly it there, and it is only the American bomb that is able to drill its way as deep as those particular areas. But apparently, according to The Economist today, America's bunker-busting bomb is not sure if it's going to work when it comes to Iran. In terms of the stakes about whether he should or shouldn't do it, and everyone's got a view on that, a reporter who literally almost died covering issues to do with the Middle East works for Fox News and was on Fox News with Jesse Waters today, explaining what the pros and the cons are. And they're always more complicated than it might seem.
the pros you laid out earlier. Look, you get rid of Iran's nuclear facility. That the US is the only country that can do that. That perhaps leads to a change in regime. As you said, the country is falling apart. People are striking. People can't afford to live. That could change the whole Middle East. With President Trump's relationships with Saudi Arabia and Israel, if the Iranian regime was to fall, you could change the region. You could pull them away from China, pull them away from Russia. It could be a geopolitical shock if that were to happen. It would be a seismic change. On the other hand, there are potential real negatives, and that is down to how Iran will respond. Look, if Iran was to go after American embassies, American ships, American bases, and Americans were killed, it would quickly lead to escalation. America would have to get involved further and further. If they shut the Straits of Hormuz, the oil prices rise. If they use their countless terror proxies around the world, we could see an outbreak.
Yeah, so it's not one and done. It's not drop it and walk away. There are consequences. We'll all find out together whether the president is going to go there. But we certainly know the internal MAGA fight about all of this, about whether they see it as a one and done or whether they see it as opening the door to going back into a forever war. Well, we all know about that in the past few days. Donald Trump was asked about all of this, and put simply, he says he is MAGA.
It seems like this issue on whether or not the United States should strike is kind of dividing a lot of your supporters.
No, my supporters are for me. My supporters are America first and make America great again. My supporters don't want to see Iran have a nuclear weapon.
And one of the issues worth noting here is that this internal MAGA fight, however principled or not principled or look at me or whatever the heck it actually is, well, that all of this amuses the left, because remember, the left are not going to ever turn around and give Trump credit. Instead, they would love the idea of a key part of his supporter base moving away, because they, of course, are utterly invested in the Trump presidency being a failure. And they see a fracturing of support for the president from his hardest core supporters as something worth laughing about.
Well, this is actually not parody, believe it or not, despite the two of them sort of acting like caricatures of themselves.